I grew up in Richfield. I was born in 1948, and our family eventually included my parents and 4 daughters. And my parents both were born and raised in small towns just within 5 miles or so of Richfield. Mom in Elsinore and my father in Venice. You know, Richfield was a small town. We were kind of rough and tumble, played outdoors all the time. Nobody worried about us. We made mud pies, climbed in the hills west of town, and built huts and went rock cutting, explored to our heart's content, and nobody worried. It was a safe and happy place to grow up, and as far as any of us knew, there were no dangers around. I don't know that I was real aware of the testing this would have been when I was about 7, 8 years old. I do remember Dad loved to go prospecting, and eventually we had a company called Gardner Mines, but he loved to go out prospecting and was involved with uranium and beryllium and other precious metals. And I remember him coming home and my sister and I sitting out on the front porch on a summer evening or an early fall evening, and I remember him getting out his Geiger counter and showing us how it worked and letting us try it in different spots in the shrubbery and the grass and on some of his rock samples, and it was just going wild, and we thought that was really interesting, and Dad did too. And I remember he let me take the Geiger counter to school. The elementary school was right across the street from our home, and let me show the other kids and the teacher how it worked. I remember at the time that some of his business interests and the family's interests were taking him to Salt Lake and back rather frequently, and my sisters and I would be teasing and wrestling and asking how much further in the back seat. But I remember they usually had the radio on, and I heard about sheep and some cattle that were found dead or that were born with strange defects, and I don't remember ever really talking to my parents about it or them saying much. I don't remember anything being said about our cattle or sheep, but I was a kid with a Nancy Drew penchant for mysteries, and it really stuck in my mind that there was this, I pictured this large area with all these dead animals and wondered what it was from. It wasn't until later on, after some other things happened, that there was a book published, I believe a Dr. Fuller, and it was called The Day They Bombed Utah. And that's when I became very aware of what had happened and the assurances from the government that everything was safe, there were no problems. I remember a little bit about people, especially in Cedar City and St. George, going out to watch the blasts and see the flashes in the sky, hear the noise, but I wasn't really aware that there were any problems at the time. It wasn't until later. Dad came up to the VA for a regular checkup to the Veterans Administration Hospital here in Salt Lake. And he and Mom, after some tests and just a regular checkup, drove back to Richfield. And when they got there, Dad immediately changed clothes and jumped in the truck and headed out to do some nighttime chores at the farm. Just within minutes, Mom got a phone call, and it was from a Dr. Graydon Harker at the VA, and he told her to give Dad a message that he needed to get back to Salt Lake just as quickly as possible, that he had determined that he had multiple myeloma, which we understood to be, we'd never heard of it before, but understood to be a rare form of cancer that is in the blood and in the bone marrow and destroys the bones, and that it was terminal and there was no cure for it. And he immediately attributed it to the nuclear fallout from the 1950s in Nevada. Dad had probably 6 months to live. And possibly, if he were very optimistic, the outside range, he might live a year. And of course, this was devastating to our family. And Dad came up to Salt Lake and saw Dr. Harker. I was with them at the VA. And after doing a few more tests, he confirmed that it was multiple myeloma. They did a spinal tap and full body x-rays and said, yes, he did have multiple myeloma. For quite a while, Dad didn't actually receive any treatment. They kept watching, they kept x-raying, they, just seeing when the serious symptoms would start. At the time, I think he had some pain in the bones and Dad was very stoic, and he was determined he was going to beat it. And he did not want to leave my mom, didn't want to leave us. He wasn't afraid of death, but he was a fighter, and he would do whatever it took. And at the time, a cousin came by from St. George, and they were excited. He and his wife were very excited to tell us about a cure or an herbal natural medicine type thing that would keep this cancer at bay. Apparently it had just saved the life of my cousin's wife's uncle. And they brought a lot of information, and Dad actually, I guess was looking for any kind of a cure after being told he had 6 months to live. And it was called Easiac tea. It was a tea that a nurse had come up with from Canada. And he went out and bought all whatever it took, the ingredients, and a special cooker, and made this tea himself and bottled it in brown bottles, and he drank it every day for a long time, and he didn't get any worse. And the doctors were sort of amazed. But they said, well, whatever you're doing, I guess keep on doing it. And then Dad's cancer started to get more aggressive. And they told him they didn't want him taking the Easiac tea anymore. They wanted him to stop everything except what they gave him. And from there until his death, he went through so much in and out of the hospitals with lots of different things. He got MRSA several times in the hospital. He had blood clots in his lungs, and the red blood cells were going. I remember going to a doctor with him here in Bountiful, and the doctor looked at the x-rays and looked at Dad and said, I don't know how this man's standing. His bones from head to toe are like they're moth-eaten. But he was able to get in on several trials of different medications. Myeloma was being researched aggressively at the time, and there were some things coming out that the doctor was able to get him in. He went in for infusions. I remember numerous times of him losing consciousness and me calling 911 and getting paramedics and ambulances here. And so many times he was so near death that we thought we'd lost him, but he would rally and come back. I remember one time going to the emergency room, and he had a pulmonary embolism. And with all the other problems with the cancer, he was nearing 90, and they said the only thing we could do is intubate him, and we would never do that to someone his age. He'd never be able to come off of it. And Dad piped up, and he just said, do it. Don't pay attention to my age, just do it. And they did, and it was a horrible week or two. I remember a time when he was bleeding profusely, and they called us. This was on New Year's Day. We had been there New Year's Eve at LDS Hospital, but on New Year's Day they called and said, get in here right now because we can't put blood in fast enough to take the place of what he's losing. And we went in fully expecting that we'd be there when we passed away, and all of a sudden the bleeding stopped, and he came out of that. But at age 91, he was here in the Bountiful Hospital. He'd been there for a couple of weeks with a pulmonary specialist. And when they let him out, He came home on a Sunday, or on a Saturday, excuse me. I brought him home, and it was springtime, just getting early spring, and he was thinking about, he gardened up here too, had a big garden, and he was thinking about planting, and the leaves were out on the trees and the flowers coming out, and it was about 2 weeks. Well, let's see, it wasn't even that long. Anyway, we had been planning a 70th anniversary celebration for Mom and Dad, but it was hard to plan around Dad's health. And at that point, on Sunday, I said, you know what, Dad? How about if we just invited some of the neighbors over tonight? I'll get a cake, and how about if some neighbors just came over? Do you feel good enough for that? Because I felt quite sure that a big celebration wouldn't be possible. That night, the neighbors came over, and it was his and Mom's 70th anniversary, and one of the neighbors had just been to Hawaii and brought fresh flower leis for them, and another neighbor came over and took some pictures that night of the two of them sitting on the love seat with these leis, and you know, they both looked healthy and smiling. The next morning, before 6 o'clock, I heard Dad yell from the next room. And I went in, and he was on the floor, writhing in pain. And he had stepped out of bed to get up and go to the bathroom. And when I got the paramedics and we got him to the hospital, and they did some x-rays, his heels had completely crushed all the bones in his heels when he stood up out of bed that morning. And they put him on morphine. He was there. I stayed with him that night. The next night I took Mom up to the hospital, and they had a good visit. And by the next morning, we had hospice workers there. My sisters and I were out in the hall outside of his room, and had just signed the papers to have hospice step in and help. And I stepped into his room. The nurse was trying to change the sheets on his bed. And I said, is there anything I can do to help? And she said, yes, could you just come and hold him up for a moment while I get this fitted sheet over the head of his bed? And I went and put my arm around Dad and lifted him up. And just within a minute or so, he gave one cough and he was gone. It was a quick death in the end. He had a lot of morphine, but he, right up until the end, made sense and knew what was going on. But that morning, I held him up, and that was it. During this time and after Dad died, I think I mentioned his doctor just immediately said it was the Downwinders radiation fallout that caused his cancer, and he was given $50,000 to compensate for that. The government gave him $50,000. It took a lot of paperwork. It was a rigmarole to get it, but he got it, kept $10,000 and gave each of my sisters and me $10,000. And they felt like the people who were directly involved with the testing, I think 150,000 or something, but I know they were involved in meetings trying to get a better compensation. $50,000 at the time seemed like a lot of money, but when you think of a life, and someone like my father, who was so active and in so many leadership roles and helped so many other people, and that's not much for a life, really.